Hello everyone, Richard here at Calvin Wazoo, bringing you another video on the genealogy of music. This is when I either go over the various connections and relationships different artists have with different bands and with each other, or I also will take a deep dive into a particular artist. And today it is the latter. I am going to be talking about a Japanese band. I've been on the lookout for this record for a long time, and it was recently reissued on vinyl. And that is this, the Flower Traveling Band. And the album's name is Satori, which is the Japanese word for sudden enlightenment. All right, so this was not their first release, and it is the only release I have. Nice, the Buddhist type and Hindu style imagery, also in the center of the gatefold. Mentions of Hare Krishna. And also the record itself on this reissue is this very nice looking, kind of a very like a blood orange, or maybe, well, it's darker than fuchsia. I don't want to necessarily call it red, though. I guess you could call it red. But very nice repressing. So let's talk about the Flower Traveling Band. This band was formed in Japan by Yuya Uchida. He was a founding member, and this was roughly around 1968, 1969, and this was after he visited a friend of his in England. Yeah, his friend inspired him to start a band. His friend? Yeah, his friend was John Lennon. And while he was in England with his friend John Lennon, he was introduced to some other bands and musicians at that time. He was introduced, for example, to Jimi Hendrix. That's a fairly significant introduction. He also was introduced to Cream. Eric Clapton, Jack Bruce, Ginger Baker. Yeah, quite a crowd of musicians. He also met and hung out with, Big Brother and the Holding Company, which was the launching pad for Janis Joplin. So Uchida had all these, meetings and these experiences with these powerful bands, power bands. I mean, Hendrix, a power trio. Cream was a power trio. And when he came back to Japan, Uchida formed, initially, the band was called Flowers. And there were two vocalists, and one of the vocalists was female. And they released an album of covers in 1969, and it was called Challenge. And this album drew a lot of attention in Japan. Not because of the music, but because the band members appeared nude on the front cover. Well, after that album was released, Uchida and the one of the singers, Remy Aso, they left Japan and went back to the US. So then the group reorganized as the Flower Traveling Band, circa, 1970. And the members of the band at that foundation were, and I have the list here, on guitar we have Hideki Ishima, bass was Jun Kazuki, drummer was Joji Wada. Wada, is that what I wrote down? It might have been I'm sure it's Wada. And the vocals were Joe Yamanaka. So they got together and they released another cover album, all right? So their second album, which was the first one as the Flower Traveling Band in 1970, was another cover album. They were all cover songs. The name of the album was Anywhere, and it included covers by Black Sabbath, which this is significant. I think this was a pretty strong influence on the band. Black Sabbath, not necessarily that particular album. Although that was released right around the time that they were doing this. Then they also did some Muddy Waters covers. All right. So the album was released called Anywhere. And again, it drew a lot of attention because, again, all the band members on the cover photo were nude. Except this time they were riding motorcycles. All right, so then they went to something called the Eckhart Expo of 1970. Not exactly sure where this happened, but they were seen by a Canadian band called Lighthouse. And Lighthouse was pretty impressed with what they were doing, so they invited them, hey, come to Canada. And, we can do some gigs together and stuff like that. So they agreed to do that. And they ended up writing quickly a bunch of songs, original songs, their first original material. And that became Satori. So this was put together, and it was done in 2 days. The recording was all done in 1 day, and then the mastering was done the following, on another day. And there are 5 songs. This is definitely a concept album. So here they were doing covers. And then with their first album of original material, they put together this concept album. So the title of the songs is, Satori Part 1, Satori Part 2, Satori Part 3. Then on side 2, you have Satori Part 4 and Satori Part 5. I've only given it a couple of listens. And but I know I had listened to it before when, decades ago, when Napster and all those places around, I was downloading music. Particularly, I was most interested in downloading Zappa bootlegs, concert bootlegs, which I still have a ton on an external drive, some of which I still haven't listened to yet. And I did a blog for a while called Frank Zappa's Revenge, and while much of it was spent talking about his studio albums, a lot of it I was talking about these bootlegs and these concert recordings. But anyway, I had downloaded the recording, of Satori. And remember when I was listening, that I'm like, man, I have to look up these guys and get their stuff. But of course, it was very difficult to find. And it still, if you want an original one, it's going to be on the pricey side. There were other formats. There were reissues on other formats, but not so much on vinyl. And we're talking about an album that is very heavy metal, very blues oriented, and also very psychedelic oriented. And the store that I bought the album at had, a little hype sticker created by the store saying that, when you start listening to Joe Yamanaka singing, you're going to think you might be listening to like Led Zeppelin 3. I really don't get that impression when I am listening to it. The influences that I hear are Black Sabbath, very much a style of guitar playing that is similar to Tony Iommi by Hideki Yashima, and also the kind of, in the recording and the presentation of the guitar, it reminds me a lot of the Byrds, or Yardbirds, Yardbirds, over, under, sideways, down. That was very much on my mind while I was listening to it. So it's a solid album, really, really quite good. And so it would look like perhaps that the band was going to be going forward and becoming fairly well known worldwide with lots of record sales. In fact, after the release of Satori, which was 1971, they toured in Canada, in New York City. They started in New York City, and then they went to, or they were touring in Canada. Oh, I think this tour was probably all in Canada. So they jammed with Lighthouse on that, but they also were an opening act for Dr. John and some Toronto gigs. And they were also playing with Emerson, Lake and Palmer. So they were getting some notoriety. And they ended up writing a new album also that was called, and I believe this was also mostly, it was all original material. It was called Made in Japan. So after this little stint in Canada, in 1972, they went back to Japan. And they were, in fact, billed to be the opening act with the Rolling Stones when they were coming over to Japan for the tour. That fell apart because of Mick Jagger's previous convictions. He was denied entry or denied a visa into Japan. So that exposure, along with the Rolling Stones, never happened. But that same year, and it was February of 1972, they did release this next album, Made in Japan, which barely made, as far as I can tell, an impact on the music scene. And I haven't heard it. I haven't heard any of these other albums, and they're, from what I've read, they're not as strong as Satori. But, they're not on my shopping list. But, if I run across one, I'll probably pick it up. The interesting thing about Made in Japan, that same year, but it was like later in the year, somebody else, was recording something in Japan that they called Made in Japan. So Deep Purple, had their that concert in Japan, which interestingly, that concert was later in 1972. So the Traveling Flower Band, their release of Made in Japan was released in February of 72. The concert that Deep Purple recorded for their release, Made in Japan, also same title, was in August, I believe it was, and then the record was not released until October that year, I believe, but it was later in the year, well after Flower Traveling Band. Thing was, Deep Purple, apparently they didn't like the recording. They had no interest in it, and they really only wanted this concert recording to be released in Japan. But the folks at the record company got their hands on it and said, no, man, we're releasing this worldwide. So they actually did it against the wishes of the band. And it was a huge hit. But in Japan, of course, it looked like this. And it wasn't called Made in Japan, because there already was an album called Made in Japan by the Flower Traveling Band. And so it was called Live. As you can see here, in Japan, it was called Live in Japan. Same set list, same song order. It's the same recording, just has different album art. And then, of course, the different title, because there already was an album called Made in Japan by a Japanese band that was published prior to this. Kind of interesting all around there. They did release another one in 1973. So, this was all in 1972. And then they released an album in 1973 called Makeup. And that was a double album, with one of the albums being live recording, and then the other album studio. But they were by this time kind of just falling off into obscurity. The really heavy impact that they made with Satori was fading already, which is, I don't know if ironic is the right word, but it's almost fitting, because, they're taking this Buddhist term, Satori, for sudden enlightenment. And then, of course, another tenet in Buddhism is that, as the George Harrison album says, all things must pass. Nothing is permanent. And certainly their notoriety was impermanent. So that was pretty much it then. After that double album that was half live and half studio from 1973, that was it. You didn't hear anything else from the band. Now, Yamanaka, all right, the vocalist, he actually did a lot of collaboration with the Wailers, Bob Marley fame. And then Hideki Ishima quit playing guitar and focused more on Indian sitar music. You can, even before he did that, you really, really hear the Indian influence in his guitar playing on Satori. And so he gave up the guitar and focused on sitar, and then he created a new instrument, which he called the sitarla, which essentially it has a solid body like an electric guitar, but it has the string orientation of a sitar. And I don't have a photo to show you, but there are some that you can find of him playing. on the internet where he's playing this really, I mean, the body of the guitar is really big. And then, you know, the strings are, it's not like a 12 string where you have double, you know, the double strings. You know, it could very well have 12 strings, but they're all very separate. And some of them are, you know, going up along the neck, but there are no frets. Very interesting instrument, which he ended up playing to audiences when the band did get together again. And they did in 2008. So 35 years later, after their last album, they got together and they thought about doing some shows, and then they were encouraged by some others, well, you should release a new album. And they did. They released the album We Are Here. And this is when they began a tour in New York City, and then they were going up into Canada to continue, you know, the tour. So it seemed like perhaps there would be a revival with the band. However, the tour got cut short because Yamanaka was diagnosed with lung cancer. So this was in 2008. And then he died in 2011. So it was already at a fairly advanced stage. And then Yuya Uchida, who was not, I'm not sure if he was with the reorganized band, you know, in 2008, but he was the original founder of the Flowers. Remember, they were called the Flowers. So the original founding member, Yuya Uchida, he died of pneumonia in 2019. Just last year. So chances of anything coming out with this band is slim to none. I would, though, highly recommend this, as I said, this reissue. I would play a little bit, except the Japanese music industry is even stricter on copyright infringement on YouTube than, which is ironic because I see a lot of Japanese bands like Toe and Mouse on the Keys. Their material, of course, it could be published by them rather than by other people. But anyway, I see a lot of their stuff on YouTube. But this one is being reissued. It's on that beautiful reddish orange, kind of maybe a blood orange color, and it sounds really good. And as I say, this is blues, electric blues, hard rock, and psychedelic, and it's all really, really, really good. Totally recommend this if you see it, because OGs of this are in the hundreds of dollars in many sellers, and if not, they're going to be close to $100. So there you have it. A little deeper look at this band that is very famous for this album and not so famous for their other ones. Interesting story. You know, I guess it pays to have influential friends, right? I hope you enjoyed this. I hope you enjoyed the channel. Subscribe. And leave a comment, some thoughts. If you've listened to some of these other albums by the Flower Traveling Band, I'm kind of curious, but as I said, I'm not real intent on tracking them down. And if I see them, I may pick them up if they're in decent condition. So leave a comment in the down under, all right? And I read them all. And beyond that, please remember to always enjoy your music.